So I'll make a start again. Last week, I introduced you to the concept of activity and its units, activities. In the previous lecture, I presented a synopsis of Hegel's logic. Although I presented the narrative of the logic as a process with a beginning and an end, Hegel points out that it is a circle which begins and ends with a totality. Initially, this totality is an undifferentiated whole, and the process of the logic is a conceptual reconstruction of that whole. Likewise, an activity has a life cycle, and it is through this life cycle that social formations continuously reconstruct themselves. I think you will see the relationship. At first, we have a certain social formation, and whether or not people are happy with their lot, things go on in the normal way. Social norms, habits, laws, and beliefs are manifested in people's everyday lives, and no one is trying to overturn them. There may indeed be injustices in this setup. Writers and academics may be criticizing aspects of the social arrangements, but in any case, no one was doing anything about it. At this point, the activity which will presently come onto the scene is, to use a well-known Hegelian expression, in itself. For example, women may be routinely subject to humiliating comments and unwanted sexual advances from their male workmates, but hey, men are like that. Don't let him get under your skin. Ignore him. The issue, one with which we are now all familiar, existed as a material thing, but it wasn't recognized. No one paid attention to it. But women were changing, weren't they? At a certain point, here and there, women started reacting, hitting back, calling out guys who were harassing them. Now, this initially wasn't a question of women starting a campaign or making some kind of collective decision that it was time to start fighting back. At this point, each individual instance is just a spontaneous response from a woman who is just trying to carry on a normal life. Asaf Bayat is an Iranian Marxist, and he gave a name to this process. He called it a social non-movement. So I'll use that term. He gives an example of 4 people in Iran who make a living by setting up little stalls on the street to sell lemonade or cigarettes or clothes or whatever. Pretty soon, the police arrive and move them along, sometimes confiscating their stuff. But they come back the next day somewhere else and set up again until the police arrive. They're just trying to earn a living. They're not looking for a fight with the police. But what you've got in each case is a kind of crime wave. Not that calling out jerks is a crime, but in those days it was breaking a social norm. Now, an astute journalist or sociologist might notice this and maybe write articles in the press about the rising number of such transgressions, and the people involved are doubtless observing what's happening all around them as well. But so at first, it's just one damn thing after another, and then someone begins counting. It might be the number of deaths in custody or the number of job resignations in a month. And once you start counting, you make comparisons and you notice, for example, that the number of reports of family violence hit an all-time high this month. Now, that may not be because there was more domestic violence, but people reported it. Not because they wanted to agitate for a campaign, but just because they thought this was a thing. It wasn't just Barry being Barry again last night. So the situation here is that something is out there and people have been counting it. It starts to be something which is recognized as a something, and the number of them is counted. At a certain point, this goes beyond just being an insignificant bit of statistics. A new quality, a new kind of thing has been identified. And for the people doing it, it's still one damn thing after another, which they have to deal with. But they read the papers as well. They know there is a wave of these things going on, but even the participants are aware of this, not as participants, but as observers. It's not driving what they're doing. They see others like themselves doing the same thing in response to the same situation, but they haven't reflected on that yet. There is consciousness, but no self-consciousness of it as a social issue among those who are doing it. So this is the first phase of an activity, a phase when in fact it doesn't exist, or more correctly, it doesn't exist for itself, it is just in itself. But it is more than pure being, a mere potential. It has reached the stage of objective existence with quantity, quality, and measure. It exists in the consciousness of observers, so many events of this or that kind, more or less, and for the sociologist, that's as far as it goes. Now, the people affected, one way or another, do begin to reflect on things, but keep in mind, nothing really happens because people thought this or thought that. The key thing is that people started doing something about it. At first, they didn't see what they were doing as challenging some social norm. They just responded, trying to get on with their lives. But then they saw that these experiences were not just personal. They reflected something about the way things are done. Something needed to be done about it. Not just their own individual response, something needed to be done about the law or the economy, about the way men behave or whatever. I like to illustrate this process of reflection, how it gets started like this. Someone puts up a poster or something and calls a demonstration or public meeting. And then when everyone arrives, someone says, we're all here for the same reason, right? This is the moment of identity. But of course, it doesn't last long. Well, actually, it might take a few years. But soon enough, people start saying, oh, I'm here for a different reason. I don't care about your glass ceiling. I just want to get the same pay as the blokes, or whatever. And so a dispute gets going about who we are. Imagine there's an argument about whether to meet at lunchtime or after work. No one can agree. A contradiction develops over this question. Eventually it comes out that people don't want to lose their lunchtime, but some people want to meet at lunchtime because they have to attend to the kids after work. So disagreements like this lead back to their ground. Once the ground of the contradiction comes to light, a solution can be found. And as successive differences come to the surface, the underlying social differences, which are the ground of differences within the movement, come to the fore and the movement adjusts. I say movement now because already we have an issue, a demand, an emergent concept, a critical of the status quo, which is beginning to be self-conscious. This is the social movement phase of an activity. When I say social movement, I mean that in the very broad sense. It doesn't just necessarily mean people marching in the streets, yelling things and waving banners. It simply means people collaborating together, objecting to something and trying to get it fixed. But it is by its very nature diverse. The women's movement isn't just the women's movement. It's radical feminism, liberal feminism, socialist feminism. It's the campaign for equal pay or against the glass ceiling or against male violence. All manner of different ideas, each with the ground in different contradictions in the social fabric, each with their own banner, all of them banging on the door from outside, trying to get a hearing. This is a kind of social cognitive process. It's unmistakable, a giant learning process with intense conflicts over the various theories and approaches to what is probably the same underlying problem, but seen from different social positions. The new activity, and here I'm using activity to refer to a countable entity, not the general substance. Even though the activity is still fractured into many parts at odds with each other, even though some of these currents may fall by the wayside altogether, I'm talking about it as an activity, but an activity which is going through a phase of being fractured and unclear and in conflict about its identity. The first issue for an emergent activity is that of form. What form is adequate to the content of this issue? Currently, the question of women's rights in Iran is taking the form of massive, very vigorous, but generally peaceful street protests. Previously, it took the form of women deliberately wearing the hijab in non-conventional ways. At one point, women wearing a long white scarf like Isadora Duncan, probably before your time, but still. Before that, it was just quietly appearing on the streets without a male relative just because they had to. But is the form of street protest sufficient? Aren't the sheer version of communes, the best vehicle for the movement now? Some women have gone into Kurdish Iraq and are training as an armed militia ready for combat with the mullah's police. Is this a mistake or is it just the wrong time? This is the struggle over form and content. So moving beyond the stage of simple reflection, which identifies the movement in different layers of the old society, different contradictions, we are now involved in the struggle of form and content. Not just the struggle of the content to find an adequate form, but also finding how to put appropriate content into available forms. Hegel deals at length with all the theoretical problems which arise in this struggle of form and content, just as he dealt with the problems of quantitative science in the logic of being, because these become real issues for the movement at this point. The next stage of a social movement is what Hegel calls actuality. This is the stage in the development of a social movement when the movement is having an effect. Changes are happening and they're getting resistance. Chains of cause and effect extend indefinitely and raise the question of reciprocity, of phenomena being the cause and the effect of themselves. The movement begins to pose the question of what is possible, what is a real possibility. What is the relationship between cause and effect? Hegel outlines a whole array of concepts which arise in trying to theorize complex social problems. The conundrum of form and content, cause and effect, freedom and necessity, possibility and real possibility, he deals with by conceptual critique. The thinkers in the social movement will recognize these conundrums, but the problems also manifest themselves in real change and transformations as the movement tries to find a way forward. The movement is like an informal university department on the issue, with all sorts of experiments underway, a host of experts with different theories, books written on various campaigns, exposés, and so on. Not only are people having to think about the dialectic of form and content, but a living dialectic of forms and contents is taking place. Not only people struggling with the dialectic of cause and effect, but the movement is experiencing causes and effects, opening new possibilities. Now, although I've presented this social movement phase of an activity as if it were a distinct phase following on the phase of being a social non-movement, this is not the case. There is a logical relation in which the concepts arise in this phase of an activity as logically derivative of the concepts associated with the earlier phase, which was confined to qualities and quantities. But the social non-movement continues, does not come to an end, so long as the social conditions which give rise to the transgressions and the conditions which made the relevant actions transgressive continue to exist. It is this fact which drives the development of the social movement phase, the continual spontaneous critique of existing conditions which carries on unself-consciously by people simply trying to live their lives. So the logical succession I've outlined is not meant to mark out chronologically distinct stages. There is a moment in the development of a social movement. In fact, there may be many such moments in the case of the really great transformative social movements, but a moment in which someone puts forward a simple slogan, or very often coins a new word or designs a logo, but in any case launches a new concept. This concept is like the aha moment in a long and difficult research program. Suddenly, something which encapsulates the problem and its solution in a nutshell, and does so in such a way that everyone, both in the movement and beyond its ranks, says, yes, that's the issue. It might be a word like sexism or a hashtag which goes viral like Me Too, or it might be Gandhi's Ashoka Chakra, representing the hand spinning wheel, which is seen on the Indian national flag today. Classically, this moment marks both a relative unity in the social movement and the first steps toward the institutionalization of the movement's demand. The women of the late 1960s picked up on the idea of racial discrimination, which had been encapsulated in the word racism, and coined sexism. We're being discriminated against too. And this new slant on women's position in society rang a bell because anti-discrimination had already been established as a principle. So very quickly, this concept moved to institutionalization. Initially, This just meant that a very wide section of the community accepted the principle and recognized it as a legitimate grievance, whereas many other expressions of feminism had never struck home like this. With this wider acceptance comes actual institutionalization, that is, laws get changed and social norms begin to take account of the new norm and change. One of the outcomes of this breakthrough is that the social movement, at least insofar as it is overt and deliberately organized transgression, begins to demobilize. This moment actually marks the beginning of the end for the movement's opponents, but it's also the beginning of the end for those who are energized and mobilized by the movements, and activists can get quite depressed by this turn in events. Women's liberation activists start taking jobs as sex discrimination officers or whatever, femocrats, as they used to say, as the movement enters a new phase, the long march through the institutions. Again, I have to recall that this is a logical and not a chronological phase. Logically, institutionalization arises on the basis of a movement, which in turn arises on the basis of a transgressive phenomenon. But chronologically, there is complete overlap. So long as the conditions which make the transgressions out of ordinary life continue to exist, there will be transgressions. And so long as people are being forced into transgressions, there will be organized demands and campaigns for social change. At a certain point, though, the demand gets institutionalized. Now, two processes begin to unfold. On the one hand, there is the internal change in the conception, which is becoming institutionalized. For example, when the demand for women not to be discriminated against, a simple enough principle, is accepted, what does that mean for the right to take out bank loans? Surely bank loans can't be obliged to loan money to single women. And what about women becoming ditch diggers? Surely not. And who pays for childcare? It turns out that what appeared to be a simple principle has many different ramifications when it's applied in different particular circumstances. And not only that, not every woman and not every man is in the same situation. Some women don't want to be ditch diggers and they don't want to play men's sport either. So from being a simple abstract principle, such as no discrimination on the basis of gender, the comment has to become extremely concrete and nuanced. That's the internal development. But how does that take place? First, the movement finds that the world is made up not just of us and them, but a whole range of other movements. Well, not movements, activities associated with different social positions. There are the Rural Women's Association. What does feminism have to say to them? There are the trade unions needed to win equal pay and other work rights for women, but they're run by men. There are all the different ethnic groups with very different ideas about gender relations and so on. So the first stage of development of the new norm and its relation to the world around it is that its advocates have to establish some relation, positive or negative, with all the other projects in the community. At first, this is a kind of mechanical relation. You don't try to change the Rural Women's Association or the Transport Workers Union or whatever, but you have to talk to them, do some deal, maybe arrange for a visiting speaker or something. In doing so, you learn about the different meanings of the core demand for different particular projects already at work in society. Development takes place by the penetration of the new institutions and the new principle into all the other institutions and movements and activities of any sort in the community. Women found themselves up against a male-dominated union movement, which is quite willing to make common cause with the employers to block women's access to male jobs, equal pay and maternity leave and so on. But what this led to is not workers against women, which is an absurdity, but the penetration of the trade union by the women's movement, setting up of women's committees and so on within the unions to fight against sexual harassment for equal pay and so on. It meant feminists in the finance and legal professions laying into the male-dominated practices of the banks and putting an end to discrimination against women in finance. Sportswomen started to campaign for equal funding and pay with men's sports. Here the issue is finding some affinity between the movements, some common cause which you combine on. So what about parental leave for men, which is in fact exactly the way that they got what do you call it, the maternity leave through the Supreme Court in the US. The culmination of this process is the long march through the institutions. It's transforming the cultural ecosystem. Every movement or project, every principle which has found a place within society so that everyone is a means to each other's ends, not just in the economic sense, but in the sense of mutually supportive social norms. It's not so much radical feminism versus liberal feminism or social feminism anymore, but women in law, women in unions, women with children, and so on. And feminism takes on a different shape in each case. As I said before, an idea becomes institutionalized and normalized within a community. Transgressions will continue and social movements will continue to be active. However, insofar as the grievances which first animated the social movement actually get resolved because the principle has been institutionalized in all the different corners of society and penetrated every other activity or project, then inevitably transgressions cease to be transgressions, or rather expressions of a well-established social norm, such as now the other is still living in the 1950s or whatever, who is the transgressor and will probably be pulled into line by the boss or given a good talking to by his wife or whatever. Throughout this process, the basic principle remains just as it was at the beginning, but it develops, it becomes more concrete. Nonetheless, in the case of all those great social movements, there are limits to what can be achieved by having your own people on the inside. Transformation of the institution seems to have gone as far as it can go. Still, we have the wealthy and powerful men like Harvey Weinstein who think they're entitled, and it's back to the barricades. And a new social movement has to be launched. So we have gone full circle. All the demands of the social movement had been fully integrated into the institutions of the community, but like any social formation, contradictions remain and new ones emerge, unnoticed, and there have all along been people subject to some injustice, and people begin to object. So we have a kind of life cycle which begins with a relatively stable social formation, which nonetheless begins to generate transgressions. These transgressive acts become more numerous, more vigorous, and develop into self-conscious movements, which eventually formulate an effective principle which gets recognized and goes on to penetrate every corner of society, transforming them, ironing out these injustices, eventually producing a changed and relatively stable social formation, and the process begins all over again. So this is a general sketch of the life cycle of activities, which I remind you are the basic units of social life. Every one of them is an historical product at one or another stage in its historical trajectory. In most cases, we have quite forgotten the historical origins of the various social practices we find around us. We just take them for granted. But all of them are transient historical entities, all changing in response to the interactions with each other in a kind of societal ecosystem. I hope that I've been sufficiently transparent in the way I've presented this outline of the development of activities that you will have recognized the similarity to the life cycle I presented in the synopsis of Hegel's logic. Next week, I will explore the relation between concepts and activities. I presume that you can't have failed to notice those two lectures were virtually repetitions of each other. One was about the development of Hegel's logic, the other about activities. And of course, it's no accident that they're almost repetitions. Ronnie.
I was saying to the people in my little group, I now have a burning desire in the vein of becoming more concrete. I'd quite like to see where someone is working with data or building an argument even, which demonstrates how someone forms up. They're digging around as an analysis in contradictions, the shifting ground, I guess, as you keep digging into contradictions, they become more overt, and then the ground shifts again. I'd quite like to see this in action in someone's work And I'm aware that any of us here could go searching for a thesis or a piece of work, and that it might not be a very good example, and you can waste a lot of time looking at a quite poor example of someone's work. So I was wondering, Andy, if you knew of any strong examples of this kind of analytical or even philosophical work that some of us might be able to go and look at just out of curiosity, to see how someone else has struggled with the data.
Okay. Generally speaking, you find different points on this continuum separately in different pieces of work. Now, you're an activity theorist, so you would know that the main way in which activity theory is developed is through formative interventions. So you won't find many papers written in that discipline that actually just give you statistics. Right? It's to activity theorists, that's regarded widely as a pretty dumb way of doing research, just collecting statistics. But what activity theorists do is that they're aware that there's a problem, and you enter into that and you try and resolve the contradiction of someone. It might be someone like a group of people who are systematically failing to graduate through teachers' college or something. So yeah, okay, you have to collect some basic data. So you track down all the people that have stopped halfway through their course, but you're not just going to get much by simply counting how many of them were, and how many were women, how many were mature students, how many were immigrants or whatever. That's like really sort of usually just tells you what you already know. But what you're going to do is you try and work out a way of overcoming the contradiction. You ask them, why did you stop the course? So that will be the sum. You look at that contradiction where they entered the course in order to become a teacher, and then at some point or other they decided not to be a teacher. So there was a contradiction. So what someone else, like you might be Mr. Piketty, who's written this famous book about capital. I don't mean Karl Marx. This is a French guy that wrote a book called Capital more recently, and it's sort of 500 pages of statistics showing how the more developed capitalism has become, the worse inequality has become. And he does this in 1,000,001 different ways, and it's, of course, very effective. Even Wall Street bankers start thinking, Jesus, am I really doing something good here? So it'd be unusual to find the whole range of things, of moments in a single research project. I really admire those people who, in activity theorists, in that domain, who do these interventions and actually change the way the system works in some part of the world, because they're not just being observers, they're participants, right? And that I'm certainly, this type of science I'm talking about here is essentially science for participants, not for observers, because observers can't really go much further than statistics and so on. That's about as far as I can go, but maybe other people will come up with ideas. Tom.
Yeah, I guess one of the like stereotypical things that people bring up against Hegel, and they say like, oh, he's teleological, and that's a problem. And in this piece, you used the term social development a few times. And obviously the way you laid it out in a way that was very useful for grasping the problem was quite linear, as in the movement would go from this to this and there'd be a certain development. I just wonder how like movements backtracking or kind of falling apart, or when things go wrong in this framework. Yeah,
that's fine. I mean, it's true that there seems to be a gap in Hegel's work, because he doesn't, I've never found any part of his work where he specifically examines degeneration where things fall apart. But understand he's not, can I put it, he's developing in the logic of logic. You know, he's not saying things go from there to there to there. The relations are logical relations. So, of course, he does in the, say, for philosophy of right, he makes some observations there which are relevant to things that fall apart. But you use the same logic to understand it. So, for example, if you have a concept like an institution that arose at a certain period under certain conditions, was responding to certain contradictions, and then at a later stage, those conditions have completely changed, and that's no longer a constitution which, a contradiction which adequately characterizes what's happening at the time. And an institution may then find itself like stranded in the sense that they're a leftover from bygone times, and necessarily then they'll degenerate. How does a degeneration take place? Through the penetration of social movements into institutions, right? So even the degeneration of institutions is itself a development process. Okay. As to the critique of Hegel for the teleology and so on, look, people that want to put Hegel down, you go to the last sort of 3 or 4 pages of a book, and where he talks in very grand, sweeping terms, you know, and you think, this is what this guy is all about. But the point is that the absolute idea is only the journey. Absolute knowledge, the final point of the phenomenology, is understanding that you are nothing other than the product of that history, awareness of your own history, right? So his ideas of teleology are extremely sophisticated. The natural world is full of striving, even little amoebas striving to get to their food source, striving to find, interact with in some particular way they had to. And the ecosystems are formed through individual organisms that are striving, they're struggling, right? That's called, like the natural will. So the thing is, teleology, that is action for a purpose, is everywhere in nature. It's not imposed on the world by God, by some outside force, by the great architect, right? The teleology that Hegel sees in the world is that natural striving of everything to maintain itself and to expand itself. It's just a feature of the natural world, striving to survive, like everyone, I think, would accept surely that Darwin wasn't a theorizer of teleology. He explained, in fact, how evolution of the species is a natural process. It's not a design process. But how does this natural selection happen? Because creatures are striving. If they didn't strive to reproduce and to raise their offspring, then you wouldn't have natural selection. So I just say, look, don't just read the last page, follow the journey, and then you'll understand the last page better. That's sort of my answer to all the, the postmodernists that want to shit on Hegel. Read the whole book. Matthew.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for a great lecture too, by the way. I think my question's sort of going on from Tom's one a little bit, but I was wondering if you had, I've been sort of wondering about like a Hegelian sort of account of backlash to social movements, particularly, it seems like a very common thing these days, and like particularly particular example of feminism, it feels like, the women's movement sort of gets, just a little bit of ground, sort of becomes complete human beings a little bit. And there's, this vitriolic, violent sort of backlash to it. And it feels like
this is the moment of actuality.
Yeah, and it feels like,
effect.
And it feels like, just like every 30 years, we're having the same arguments that we were supposedly resolved, 30 years ago, but they're back again and we have to have it all over again. So I guess I just wondered, what you had thoughts about the backlash to social movement.
Yeah, I think in Lenin's philosophical notebooks, he underlines this passage that the contradictions is the source of all life. And this is certainly the case. Without contradiction, there's no life, there's no movement. I think that's right. The phrase was contradiction is the source of all movement. So, of course, a movement develops, say, for women's emancipation, like maybe particularly in favor of affirmative action. And a lot of men will come out of the wood, say, I got this on merit. What's this business of affirmative action? I'm opposed to that. That's not really a matter. I mean, movements don't develop by steamrolling that. They respond to it, right? And it means a critique to show that the appointment process itself was gendered. So that from affirmative action, you go to changing the appointment process so that the gender prejudices aren't built into the appointment process, blind CVs, gender balance in appointment committees and so on. Right, so without the opposition of men standing up and saying they're against, they got appointed on merit, what's this all about? You'd never have made that discovery, because in confronting that contradiction, it was necessary to develop the earlier idea of affirmative action to get improvements in appointment processes. So contradiction is the source of all movement, fundamental, beginning to end of Hegel's logic. Michael.
Yeah, hi, Andy. Earlier you chose a couple of words which I kind of picked up on because I'm familiar hearing them in another context, and that was an undifferentiated whole. Unfortunately, I can't remember precisely what you were referencing, but I'm familiar with that phrase from Adorno's work, and he's using that to describe mass society and kind of regression in the 20th century after the crisis of Marxism and the failure of the revolutions of 1917 and the German Revolution and all the rest. And while I'm not asking you to comment on Adorno, because I'm not sure how familiar you are or not, I was just wondering how you were meaning the sense undifferentiated whole with respect to Hegel. Like, what does Hegel mean when he talks about something being like an undifferentiated thing as opposed to a differentiated thing, and how does that imply the whole or the universal or the totality?
Okay, the undifferentiated whole is your starting point. So philosophy began with Parmenides saying everything is being, right? So that was in the first emergence of philosophy in ancient Europe was this conception that it's all just about being, right? An undifferentiated whole. And so cognition begins from that. You go out in the morning and it's just like any other day, right? Nothing new, same old, but then something happens, I think, oh, Jesus, fancy that. I think I've seen that before, actually. Yeah. In fact, that happens quite a lot. So already, if, and of course, you might just go to work in a bloody dream and not notice anything, and nothing will happen. But the thing is, at some point or other, you notice something, right? And then, so already the whole is no longer undifferentiated. Something's come out. And then the process then is to think about it. Say, that was really nasty, that. Why did that happen? No. Like in the old days in Melbourne, you used to have quite a lot of intersections that didn't have traffic lights on them. Sorry, no, they had traffic lights, but the lights would be turned off at midnight and come on again at 6 a.m, right? Unbelievable, but that's how it used to be done. And my mother actually had an accident on one of these intersections. And being the sort of person she was, she didn't just pay her fine and say, sorry about that and do it again. She challenged it and she went into court and say, there was no way of knowing that that was a dangerous intersection. The traffic lights should be maybe just turn on with a flashing orange light during the night when the traffic's low. So the law was changed. You don't have these flashing orange lights around anymore, but you used to. But you don't have traffic lights being turned off at night either. So the undifferentiated whole ceases to be undifferentiated when you not only notice something, but you do something about it. And then that whole process of doing something about it gets to a new world. All intersections are controlled one way or another. They've got roundabouts or traffic lights or something, right? So that won't ever happen again. It's a new, undifferentiated whole, right? You don't have roads just crossing like that, like major roads, right? So it's a new whole. So that difference of controlled light crossings where the lights have been turned off doesn't exist any longer. But there'll be other contradictions that arise, right? And someone else will discover that, whatever, something comes up and it changes again, right? So it's the beginning and end of a cycle, right? I bet.
Okay, just on the part where it says it's close to that undifferentiated, the process of logic is a conceptual reconstruction. That just it resonated with the idea, particularly with that concept you put in, that this is not a chronological thing, it is a logical thing. And it's pretty much in one of those critiques against the idea of positivism that I found really interesting, because in most cases positivist sciences are, as you said, concerned with things like statistics and stuff like that. They're concerned with constant conjunctions of events, which puts things in a very chronological way, that this must come first and this, and that kind of regularity defines the world, and it defines how scientific inquiry is to be done, which is very different from this whole idea that they can they overlap, and such that the relationship is more of a conceptual reconstruction, such that natural necessity is not just these constant conjunction of events, these regularity of patterns that can be observed, but rather how they can be reconstructed in thought, and that such that the conceptual also with experience, that is what exhausts what is apparently naturally necessary.
Yeah. So the conceptual reconstruction is like, well, we could say that Marx's Capital is a conceptual reconstruction of bourgeois society, or the market, if you like. Of course, it's incomplete. The guy died in 1883 and the world carried on, but he started off with just statistics and what Engels could tell him about how business people operated, and you had just sort of this raw data, and now all this raw data, it's meaningless. It's just rich in content, but poor in conceptual. And then you start off with a simple idea of value, surplus value, necessary labor time, and you build up a new picture. So if you ever got to the end of that, which of course he didn't, and you never would, right? They'll abolish capitalist economy before you get a complete theory of it. But if you did, you will have reconstructed that moment by moment activity of a price here and a price there and a sale here and a purchase there in theory, conceptual theory. So that's what conceptual reconstruction means, right? It's building a theory which realizes what you see in observation, right?
Yeah.
But of course, the point you made about that, of the fact of that everything's sort of overlapping and cyclical and so on, is because we have concrete concepts. I've not just got these simple definitions. Because if you stick to the positivist, logical positivist, simple definition, you can't get any development at all. Everything is just like a sort of like a billiard table with balls bouncing against each other.
Yeah, and that idea of always looking at truth in science as the description of regularity, that doesn't imply any development, because it's like it's the thing like particularly I'm pretty critical of when I look at econometrics in economics, because when you keep looking at these things, you're only describing things that are actually being done today. You're not looking at things conceptually about what else can be done. You can, of course, we can observe that inflation's going this way, this way, this way, but you're looking at a current state
so
of
one
affairs.
unusual event, something that didn't happen the way it usually does, could be the beginning of a whole insight about how the system works. It may have only been 1 in 100 cases, but you see that one and you think, oh, how did that happen? It's not supposed to happen. And out of that grows some insight. Now, oh, yes, Pip, good. I'm glad you had your hand up. I was going to dob you in if you didn't say something.
Thanks so much for the lectures, Andy. So cool to hear you talk about all of this, and to begin to bring in the social movement, I guess, element as well, and how it kind of mirrors Hegel. So I really appreciate that. I don't really have any questions. I was just going to say, I just find it interesting the way that statistics is spoken about, because I don't know, I guess I just think that it gets almost pigeonholed, or it seems like people maybe don't really know exactly what it is. Not to be like harsh, but my partner studies statistics, and I feel like statistics is basically a set of like complex mathematical formula which brings in formulas which bring in social concerns, such as what level of regularity or irregularity is relevant to your study. And I just think I'm not sure exactly how you could study irregularity or contradiction without viewing regularity. And so there needs to be some kind of mechanism or equation for understanding what regularity even is. And that's how you end up observing irregularity. So I'm just not sure exactly where the skepticism for scientific method as a sort of basic thing comes from, such as statistics, like, for example, statistics.
Okay, look, I have to stop.
I understand why
I only got a couple of minutes.
I understand the critique of the institutions, but yeah, I'm just wondering if maybe we could draw that up next week or something, how science, which Hegel does speak about, isn't just, it's not like scientific institutions are just all bad. And I don't think that's what Hegel would have.
No, on the contrary. What we're talking about is science. We're talking about science. Now, probably Pip and Abet could find each other's emails and have a bit of exchange on that particular topic. Look, I've done statistics. I used to teach it many, 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 many years ago, and it's a fascinating science. And that the point is that it gives an observer's picture of the world, right? That it's quantitative science. It has a place. There are some issues where the qualitative science required to really do something about it just isn't available, or the understanding of the problem or the issue is so embryonic that the use of statistics, or the problem might be so complex that only by the use of really sophisticated statistics can you make it visible, right? But the thing is that you're only going to change that by intervening. So it means that the people that are generating the statistics, i.e. are the things that are being counted, have to start doing something different. And that I talk about statistics as basically observer science. But what's required is participant science, and getting the statistics to change because people start behaving differently is a whole layer above the question of getting a good picture of reality through statistics. Yeah, it's a whole leap from that. So all the stuff about statistics, Hegel spends a massive amount of time going through. I mean, statistics was ultra primitive, didn't exist as a separate science in his day. But he deals with calculus and a number of other things at enormous length in the first part of the science of logic. You know, it doesn't dismiss it, but the thing is, it is not, it's an observer view of the world, not a participant view. But what you change the world by participating, and knowing that you've been counted is small compensation to actually changing the circumstance you're in. So sorry for rushing you a bit there, Pip. I'm glad you got that in. you know, I have my own love for statistics as well. I'll see everyone next week, I hope, and we'll have the new reading up for next week, as I say, within 24 hours, and we'll make this exploration a little bit more concrete.